Millionaire abandons his mother. 10 years later, he sees her at the airport and is shocked to discover that she, Daniel Reeves, raced through the airport, his heart pounding. He was late for an important flight, a meeting that could seal the biggest deal of his career. His footsteps echoed on the floor as he weaved through other passengers. "Gate 23, Gate 23, he muttered, scanning the signs with his eyes. Rounding a corner, Daniel collided with someone. Papers flew into the air, and he heard the sound of something hitting the floor. "I'm sorry," he said automatically without looking at the person. His eyes were fixed on the clock, 5 minutes until boarding. "That's all right, sir," a soft and familiar voice replied. Daniel froze. That voice. He knew it. Slowly, he turned to face the person he had bumped into. It was a middle-aged woman dressed in an airport cleaning uniform. Her gray hair was pulled into a simple bun, and lines of fatigue marked her face. But it was her eyes that caught Daniel. Eyes he knew better than his own. "Mom?" The word slipped out before he could stop it. The woman looked at him confused. "Sorry, sir?" Daniel blinked, stunned. It was Margaret, no doubt, his mother. But she didn't recognize him. How could she? The skinny boy from the trailer park had transformed into a sharp businessman. His hair was different. He wore contacts now, and years of a comfortable life had changed his physique. I'm sorry," Daniel stammered. "I thought you were someone else." Margaret smiled kindly. "No problem, sir. It happens." She bent down to pick up the scattered papers and the object that had fallen, a small bottle of pills. Daniel noticed her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the items. Without thinking, he knelt down to help her. Their fingers brushed as they both reached for the same paper. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. "Thank you," Margaret said, standing up. "You're very kind." Daniel stood, his mind swirling. His mother was right there in front of him, and she had no idea who he was. What should he do? Reveal his identity? Hug her and beg forgiveness for all the years of absence? Before he could decide, an announcement echoed over the speakers. "Final call for Flight 372 to New York, Gate 23. Reality hit Daniel like a punch. His flight, the meeting, the deal that would define his career. "Have a nice day, sir," Margaret said, already walking away with her cleaning cart. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, to call her back, but no sound came out. He stood there, frozen, as his mother disappeared into the crowd. "Final call for passenger Daniel Reeves," the voice over the loudspeaker announced. The sound of his name snapped him out of his trance. Daniel looked toward where his mother had gone, then toward the boarding gate. His corporate future called to him from one side, his forgotten past from the other. With a heavy heart and a mind in turmoil, Daniel made his choice. He ran to the gate, handed over his ticket, and boarded the plane. Sitting in his seat, Daniel stared out the window, watching the airport shrink as the plane took off. Somewhere down below, his mother continued her routine, unaware that she had just encountered the son she hadn't seen in a decade. During the flight, Daniel couldn't focus on the meeting documents. His mind kept drifting back to the brief encounter. Margaret's tired face, her trembling hands, the pill bottle. She looked so fragile, so different from the strong woman he remembered. Questions plagued his mind. Why was she working as a cleaner in an airport? Was she sick? Where did she live now? Was she happy? And the most painful question of all, did she still think of him? Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of guilt and regret. He had promised to come back, promised to make it all worth it. But the years passed, and he never fulfilled that promise. Now, confronted with the reality of his aging mother, seemingly struggling, Daniel felt more lost than ever. He had achieved everything he ever wanted in the business world, but at what cost? The pilot announced they were approaching New York. Daniel adjusted his seat, trying to pull himself together. He had an important meeting ahead, a deal that could solidify his empire. Daniel entered his mansion, tossing the keys onto the table. Silence enveloped him, in stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. He loosened his tie, feeling suffocated not by the fabric, but by the weight of the memories the airport encounter had triggered. Walking to his office, Daniel paused in front of a wall filled with awards and recognitions. Every trophy, every photo with celebrities and politicians was a testament to his success. But now, for the first time in years, those symbols felt hollow. He sat in his chair, turning on the computer to review the merger documents. Numbers and graphs filled the screen, but Daniel couldn't focus. His mind wandered to a distant time, a life that seemed to belong to someone else. He closed his eyes and was transported back to the trailer park where he grew up. The smell of freshly cut grass filled his senses. He saw himself at 8 years old, sitting on the worn steps of the trailer, waiting for his mother to come home from work. Margaret arrived, exhausted as always, but with a smile on her face. "Hey, champ," she said, ruffling Daniel's hair. "How was school today?" Young Daniel proudly showed her a test with a perfect score. Margaret hugged him tightly, her eyes shining with pride. "You're going places, my son," she said, "farther than I could ever go." The memory faded, and Daniel opened his eyes, back in his luxurious office. He looked at his hands, now smooth, so different from his mother's calloused hands. His phone rang, pulling him back to reality. It was his assistant, reminding him of tomorrow's merger meeting. Daniel responded mechanically, his mind still caught between the past and the present. After hanging up, he turned his attention back to the merger documents. This was the opportunity he had worked for years. A merger that would double the value of his company, solidifying his position as one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. But the words on the screen blurred, meaningless. All Daniel could see was his mother's tired face at the airport, her trembling hands holding the pill bottle. Frustrated, he stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city lights gleamed, a testament to the world he had conquered. But at what cost? Daniel remembered the promise he had made to himself years ago when he left the trailer park. He swore that one day he would come back, that he would take his mother out of that life of hardship, that he would make it all worthwhile. But the years passed, and that promise was buried under layers of ambition and success. Each new contract, each acquisition, each dollar earned pulled him further away from his roots, from his mother. Daniel returned to his desk, opening a locked drawer. Inside, hidden beneath piles of important documents, was an old photo. He and his mother, smiling, in front of the old trailer. It was the last photo they took together before he left. Holding the photo, Daniel felt a mix of emotions: guilt, regret, longing. How had he let so much time pass? How had he forgotten the person who sacrificed everything for him? The contrast between the life he lived now and the life he left behind was stark. On one side, a corporate empire, wealth beyond imagination, power and influence. On the other, an aging mother, working as a cleaner, struggling to survive. Daniel placed the photo on top of the merger documents. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his choices. The success he had longed for suddenly seemed like too high a price to pay. He picked up his phone, hesitant. Part of him wanted to call the airport immediately, find out more about his mother, do something to help her. But another part, the part that had taken him so far in the business world, reminded him of the crucial meeting the next day. Daniel stood there, paralyzed between two worlds: the empire he had built and the roots he had abandoned. The decision he made now would not only define his future, but also redeem or condemn his past. Daniel woke up before the alarm, his mind still filled with the memories stirred up by seeing his mother. He got up, preparing himself mechanically for the important merger meeting. As he sipped his coffee, Daniel allowed himself to dive deeper into his memories. He saw himself again as a 12-year-old boy, sitting at the kitchen table in the trailer, doing homework by candlelight. The electricity had been cut off again. Margaret came in, carrying grocery bags. She looked older than her 35 years, worry lines marking her face. "I got an extra shift at the diner," she said, placing the bags on the table. "We'll have food for the rest of the week." Daniel looked at his mother, noticing the deep circles under her eyes and her calloused hands. At that moment, he made a silent promise to himself. One day, he would get his mother out of that life. The memory faded, and Daniel found himself back in the present, in his luxurious kitchen. The contrast was stark. He sighed, picking up his phone. There was an important meeting ahead, but something inside him was pushing him to act. With hesitant fingers, he typed a message to his assistant. "I need information on an airport employee. Name, Margaret Bennett, discreetly." After sending the message, Daniel left for the office. During the merger meeting, he struggled to stay focused, but his mind kept drifting back to his mother, to the past he had left behind. After hours of intense negotiations, the merger was finally agreed upon. Daniel should have felt elated, but all he felt was emptiness. Returning to his private office, he found a folder on his desk. His assistant had been quick and efficient, as always. With his heart pounding, Daniel opened the folder. The information was sparse, but enough to make his stomach drop. Margaret Bennett, 62 years old, a cleaning employee at the airport for 5 years. Address, a neighborhood known for high crime and poverty. No information on health insurance or savings. Daniel closed his eyes, remembering the day he left the trailer park. He was 18, with a partial scholarship to a prestigious business school, and dreams bigger than the world. "I'll be back, Mom," he promised, hugging Margaret for the last time. "I'll make it all worth it. You'll see." Margaret smiled through her tears. "I know you will, son. I'm so proud of you." Daniel left that night, determined to conquer the world. The years that followed were a constant struggle. He worked part-time jobs, studied tirelessly, and took every opportunity that came his way. Slowly, he began to rise in life. Each new success was accompanied by a pang of guilt. Daniel wondered how his mother was doing, whether she understood why he had left. But the higher he climbed, the harder it became to look back. The fear of failure, the shame of not having fulfilled his promise yet, kept him from reaching out. And so, the years passed. Daniel Reeves became a well-known name in the business world. His face appeared in magazines, his opinion valued by industry leaders. But the promise made to that woman in the trailer park remained broken. Back in the present, Daniel stared at the photo of his mother in the report. The face that once radiated strength now showed the signs of time and hardship. How could he have let this happen? Determined, Daniel grabbed his phone. "Cancel my appointments for the rest of the day," he instructed his assistant. "And get me a car, no driver." Minutes later, Daniel was driving through the city streets, heading toward the neighborhood where his mother lived. As the sleek buildings gave way to decaying structures, He felt the weight of his years of absence. Parking in front of a rundown building, Daniel hesitated. What would he say to her? How would he explain all the years of silence? Gathering his courage, he got out of the car. That's when he saw her. Margaret was leaving the building, dressed in her work uniform, looking tired but determined. For a moment, Daniel saw in her the same strength that had inspired him as a child. He took a step forward, ready to call out to her, to reveal his identity. But something held him back. Would it be fair to just show up after all this time? To turn her life upside down without warning? Daniel stepped back, watching as his mother walked to the bus stop. He would follow her, make sure she got to work safely, and then he would make a plan. A plan to finally fulfill the promise he had made so long ago, but this time the right way. Sometime later, Daniel sat in his office, phone in hand. He hesitated for a moment before dialing the number. "Hawkins Private Investigations, how can I help?" a voice answered. "I need information on someone," Daniel said, his voice low. Discreetly, after providing Margaret's details, Daniel hung up, feeling a mix of anxiety and guilt. It was strange to hire someone to investigate his own mother, but he needed to know more before making any moves. The office door opened and Vanessa walked in. She was an elegant woman, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Sweetheart, don't forget about dinner with my parents tonight," she said, approaching to kiss him. "They're excited to discuss the wedding details." Daniel nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course, I'll be there." As soon as Vanessa left, Daniel sighed. The wedding felt more like a business deal than a union of love. But it was a powerful alliance, joining two of the most influential families in the city. Hours later, during a crucial meeting with investors, Daniel found himself distracted. While they discussed financial projections, his mind wandered to the tired face of Margaret at the airport. "Mr. Reeves?" one of the investors called. "Is everything okay?" Daniel blinked, snapping back to reality. "Yes, sorry. Where were we?" He forced himself to focus, but the feeling of unease lingered. For the first time, the numbers and charts felt empty, devoid of real meaning. After the meeting, Daniel received a message from the investigator. His heart raced as he read the preliminary report. Margaret lived in a poor neighborhood, worked long hours at the airport, and there were records of several visits to a local clinic. Guilt hit him like a wave. While he lived in luxury, his mother was struggling to survive. That night, at dinner with Vanessa's parents, Daniel felt like an imposter. As they discussed the wedding menu and VIP guest list, he couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. "Daniel, darling, you've been so quiet," Vanessa's mother remarked. "Are you worried about the merger?" He forced another smile. "Just tired. It's been a hectic week." Vanessa squeezed his hand under the table, but the gesture felt more possessive than comforting. The next day, as Daniel was reviewing some contracts, his assistant hurried in. "Mr. Reeves, there's a journalist here to see you. She says it's urgent." Daniel frowned. "I don't have any interviews scheduled." "She insists. Says it's about your life story." Intrigued and slightly apprehensive, Daniel agreed to see her. Sarah Mitchell entered his office with determined steps. She was young, with sharp eyes that seemed to see through his carefully constructed facade. "Mr. Reeves, thank you for seeing me," she said, sitting down. "I'm working on a piece about successful executives and their origins. Your story is particularly interesting." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. "My story isn't anything special, Miss Mitchell. Just hard work and determination." Sarah tilted her head. "Really? Because my sources suggest something different, like the trailer park where you grew up, or your mother, who still works as a cleaner." Daniel's blood ran cold. How did she know that? "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to maintain his composure. Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in her eyes. "Mr. Reeves, I believe we have a lot to discuss. How about coffee tomorrow, away from prying ears?" Before Daniel could respond, she stood up and left, leaving him stunned. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Sarah's words echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of his childhood and the recent image of Margaret at the airport. He got up, walking to the window of his bedroom. The city glowed below, a testament to his success. But now, for the first time, Daniel wondered if the cost of that success had been too high. His phone buzzed with a message from the investigator. More details about Margaret's situation had arrived. With a heavy heart, Daniel opened the file. What he read left him devastated. Margaret wasn't just struggling financially, she was also facing serious health problems. The medical report indicated a heart condition that required urgent treatment. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of years of neglect. He had promised to return, promised to make it all worth it. And now, his mother was sick and alone, while he lived a life of luxury. Morning arrived, finding Daniel still awake, his mind a storm of emotions and tough decisions. The empire he had built, the wedding he was planning, the image he projected to the world, it all seemed to be falling apart. And at the center of it all was Margaret, the mother he had abandoned, but who had never truly left his heart. Daniel arrived early at the office, determined to take action. With his fingers trembling slightly, he accessed his personal bank account and created a new fund. For MB, he typed in the description field, transferring a significant amount. He hesitated before completing the transaction. Was it enough? How could he make sure the money reached Margaret without raising suspicion? His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Vanessa. "Daniel, darling, don't forget about the menu tasting this afternoon. It's crucial for our wedding." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his obligations. "Of course, I'll be there." After hanging up, he completed the transfer, promising himself he'd find a way to get the money to his mother. Later, at the tasting, Daniel could hardly focus on the elaborate dishes in front of him. Vanessa and her mother were eagerly discussing wines and floral arrangements. "Daniel, are you listening?" Vanessa asked, her tone slightly irritated. "We need to decide on the cake." He forced a smile. "Whatever you prefer, dear." Vanessa frowned but continued talking to the chef. Daniel wondered how his life had come to this point. An arranged marriage, extravagant parties, while his mother barely had enough to get by. Leaving the tasting, Daniel decided to stop by the hospital where, according to the investigator, Margaret had her checkups. He needed to see for himself, to understand how bad things were. At the hospital, Daniel felt out of place. The smell of antiseptic and the sound of heart monitors took him back to his childhood, visiting Margaret after her long shifts at work. Walking down the corridors, he searched for any sign of his mother. Suddenly, he saw her. Margaret was sitting in a wheelchair, waiting to be seen. She looked so fragile, so different from the strong woman he remembered. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to run to her, hug her, and beg for forgiveness. But something stopped him. Fear? Shame? He couldn't tell. As he watched from a distance, a nurse approached Margaret, handing her some papers. Daniel overheard bits of their conversation. Words like expensive treatment and limited options made his heart sink. Lost in thought, Daniel didn't notice someone approaching from behind. "Mr. Reeves?" He turned, surprised to see Sarah Mitchell, the journalist. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to keep his composure. Sarah glanced from Daniel to Margaret, who was now being wheeled into an exam room. "I think the question is, what are you doing here, watching your mother from a distance?" Daniel felt his blood run cold. "How did you—" "I have my sources," Sarah replied, her tone softening slightly. "Mr. Reeves, I think we need to talk." Before Daniel could respond, his phone rang again. It was his assistant informing him of an emergency at the office. "I have to go," he told Sarah, feeling pulled in 1,000 different directions. Sarah nodded. "Don't worry, Mr. Reeves. We'll continue this conversation soon." Back at the office, Daniel found himself in the middle of a crisis. One of the main investors was threatening to withdraw support for the merger. For hours, he worked to calm tempers and renegotiate terms, but his mind was divided. Every time he looked at the numbers on his screen, he saw Margaret's tired face. Late at night, exhausted, Daniel finally arrived home. Vanessa was waiting for him, a disapproving look on her face. "Where have you been? I've been trying to call you all day." Daniel sighed. "There was an emergency at work." "There always is," Vanessa replied coldly. "Daniel, we need to talk about your priorities. This wedding—" But Daniel wasn't listening. His gaze had fallen on a framed photo on the wall. It was of him and Vanessa at a charity event, smiling for the cameras. The image seemed so fake now, so empty. "Daniel!" Vanessa's voice snapped him back. "Are you listening to me?" He turned to her, feeling a sudden clarity. "Vanessa, I need some time." "What? What are you talking about?" "I need to figure some things out, things from my past." Vanessa stared at him, confused and angry. "What past? Daniel? What's going on?" But he was already leaving, grabbing his keys. "I'll call you tomorrow." Daniel drove aimlessly around the city, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He stopped at an overlook, gazing down at the city lights. Taking out his phone, he hesitated for a moment before dialing a number he hadn't used in years. "Hello?" a sleepy voice answered. "Tom, it's Daniel. Daniel Reeves. I need your help." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Tom replied, "I never thought I'd hear your voice again, man. What happened?" Daniel took a deep breath. "It's about my mom. I saw her today and... Tom, I've messed everything up. I need to make things right." As he explained the situation to his old friend, Daniel felt the weight of years of secrets and regrets. But he also felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Daniel was in his office reviewing documents when his assistant announced the arrival of Sarah Mitchell. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for the confrontation. Sarah entered, her gaze determined. "Mr. Reeves, I think it's time we had a frank conversation." Daniel nodded, motioning to a chair. "Please, have a seat." Sarah opened her folder, pulling out some photos and documents. "I found some interesting discrepancies in your official story, Mr. Reeves. For example, this photo." She slid a picture across the table. It was an old photo of Daniel and Margaret in front of the trailer. Daniel's heart raced. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I have my sources," Sarah replied. "What intrigues me is why a man as successful as you would let his mother live in such poor conditions." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of years of secrets. When he opened them, there was a new resolve in his gaze. "Ms. Mitchell, what I'm about to tell you can't leave this room. Not yet." He began to speak, his voice low and intense. He told her about his childhood in the trailer park, Margaret's sacrifices, and his decision to leave in pursuit of success. "I promised myself I'd come back, that I'd make it all worth it," Daniel said, his voice cracking. "But the higher I climbed, the harder it became to look back." Sarah listened intently, her face a mix of compassion and journalistic curiosity. Why are you telling me this now? Daniel sighed. Because I recently found my mother by chance, and I realized how much I've failed her. As he spoke, Daniel felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It was the first time in years that he had shared his true story with anyone. Sarah asked a few more questions, taking notes quickly. Then she stopped, looking at Daniel with a new understanding. Mr. Reeves, do you realize that this story could destroy the image you've built? Daniel nodded slowly. I know, but I'm tired of living a lie. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Tom, Daniel's childhood friend, walked into the office. Dan, I got the information you asked for about... Tom paused when he saw Sarah. Sorry, I didn't know you had company. Sarah quickly stood up. No, please, come in, Mr. Tom. Tom Baker, he replied, looking curiously between Daniel and Sarah. Daniel made the introductions, briefly explaining the situation to Tom. His old friend nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. Sarah's a journalist, Daniel explained. She found out the truth about me. Tom let out a long sigh. It was only a matter of time, wasn't it, Dan? Sarah looked at Tom with interest. Mr. Baker, you've known Daniel for a long time? Tom laughed without humor. Since we were kids in the trailer park. I saw it all happen. The three of them sat down, and Tom began to share his own memories. He talked about young Daniel, determined to escape poverty, about Margaret, working tirelessly to give her son a better chance. When Dan left, promising to come back, I thought he really would, Tom said, his voice heavy with emotion. But the years went by, and he never returned. Margaret never lost hope, you know? Daniel felt the tears burn his eyes. I wanted to come back, Tom, but the longer I waited, the harder it got, Tom finished. I get it, man. But Margaret, she needs you now. Sarah, who had been listening attentively, suddenly seemed to make a decision. Mr. Reeves, Daniel, what are you planning to do now? Daniel looked at her, then at Tom. I'm going to do what I should have done years ago. I'm going to help my mother no matter the cost. Sarah nodded slowly. And the merger? Your marriage? Daniel hesitated, the reality of his words sinking in. I don't know, but I know I can't keep living this lie. Tom put a hand on Daniel's shoulder. I've got your back, man. Whatever you need. Sarah closed her notebook. Mr. Reeves, I came here expecting to find a corporate villain. Instead, I found, a much more complicated story. She stood up, extending her hand to Daniel. I won't publish anything without your permission, but I hope you'll consider sharing your story. It could help a lot of people. Daniel shook her hand, feeling a mix of gratitude and apprehension. Thank you, Sarah. I'll think about it. After Sarah left, Daniel and Tom sat in silence for a moment. And now? Tom finally asked. Daniel stood up, looking out the window at the city below. Now, I'm going to see my mother. It's time to make things right. As he prepared to leave, Daniel knew he was about to turn his life upside down. But for the first time in years, he felt at peace with his decisions. Daniel sat in his office, staring at the computer screen. In front of him, the merger numbers flashed, promising record profits. Next to the monitor was a photo of Margaret, which Tom had recently given him. His phone rang. It was the head of the hospital's medical team. Mr. Reeves, we've reviewed Mrs. Bennett's case. The treatment is possible, but costly. Daniel took a deep breath. How much? The amount mentioned made his stomach turn. It was a significant sum, even for him. Do whatever is necessary, Daniel replied. Send me the details. I'll cover all the costs. Hanging up, Daniel looked back at the screen. The merger represented everything he had worked so hard to achieve. Canceling it would mean losing millions, maybe even billions. But Margaret's face in the photo reminded him of what truly mattered. The door opened and Vanessa walked in. "Daniel, we need to talk about your strange behavior these past few days," she said, her voice tense. He turned to face her, realizing for the first time how distant they had become. "Vanessa, No, listen to me," she interrupted. "I've heard rumors. People are saying you're considering canceling the merger. Is it true?" Daniel hesitated. "I'm reevaluating some things." Vanessa's face hardened. "Reevaluating? Daniel, do you have any idea what's at stake? Our future, our position in society. There are more important things than social status, Vanessa." She stared at him, incredulous. "What happened to you? Where is the man I committed to?" Daniel stood up, walking to the window. "Maybe he never really existed." Vanessa approached, her voice softer now. "Daniel, darling, whatever you're going through, we can work through it together. Think about our marriage, everything we've planned." He turned to her, seeing not the woman he loved, but a stranger. "Vanessa, I need to tell you something." In the next few minutes, Daniel revealed everything. His true background, the reunion with Margaret, and his doubts about the merger. Vanessa listened in silence, her face shifting from shock to anger. "You're throwing everything away for a housekeeper?" she finally exploded. "She's my mother, Vanessa. She's nobody. We're somebody, Daniel. What will people say?" Daniel felt a wave of disappointment. "Is that what matters to you? What people will say?" Vanessa took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. "Listen, we can handle this discreetly. Give her some money, put her in a nursing home. But don't throw your life away." Her words hit him like a slap. Daniel realized he was looking at a stranger. "I think we made a mistake, Vanessa," he said quietly. She stared at him, slowly understanding. "Don't you dare, Daniel. Don't you dare end this over that." "I'm sorry," he replied, removing the engagement ring. Vanessa took the ring, her eyes blazing with fury. "You'll regret this, Daniel Reeves. I swear you will." She stormed out, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. Minutes later, Sarah Mitchell entered the office, looking agitated. "Mr. Reeves, I'm sorry to intrude, but I thought you should know. Your ex-fiancée just made a statement to the press." Daniel felt his heart sink. "What did she say?" Sarah hesitated. She revealed your true background and hinted that you're canceling the merger for questionable personal reasons." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his decisions. When he opened them, he saw Sarah looking at him with a strange expression. "What is it?" he asked. Sarah shook her head as if clearing her thoughts. "Nothing, it's just, are you really willing to sacrifice everything?" Daniel looked again at the photo of Margaret. "Some things are more important than money or status, Sarah." She watched him for a moment, then nodded. "You know, when I started investigating you, I thought I'd find just another greedy executive. But now, their eyes met, and for a moment, something passed between them, an understanding, maybe even a connection." The moment was interrupted by Daniel's phone ringing again. It was his assistant, informing him of the chaos erupting in the company due to Vanessa's revelations. "Mr. Reeves," Sarah said softly, "what are you going to do now?" Daniel stood up, a new determination in his eyes. "I'm going to do the right thing, Sarah. For the first time in a long time." He grabbed his coat, ready to face the storm brewing outside. "Want to come with me?" he asked Sarah. "I think you'll want to see this." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then picked up her notepad. "Lead the way, Mr. Reeves." Daniel and Sarah exited the company building, facing a swarm of reporters. Camera flashes went off as questions were shouted from all sides. "Mr. Reeves, is it true you grew up in a trailer park? Will the merger be called off?" Who's the mysterious woman at the airport? Daniel raised his hand, asking for silence. I will make an official statement soon. Please respect my privacy at this time. He and Sarah quickly got into the car, escaping the chaos. Where are we going? Sarah asked, her notepad ready. Daniel hesitated. The hospital. I need to see my mother. On the way, Daniel's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Messages from board members, business partners, even old friends curious about the rumors. Sarah watched Daniel, noticing the tension on his face. Are you okay? He sighed. Honestly, I don't know. Everything's falling apart, but somehow I feel free. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to disappear. Daniel leaned in slightly, and Sarah did the same. Their lips were just inches apart when the phone rang again, breaking the moment. It was Tom. Dan, where are you? We need to talk. I'm on my way to the hospital, Daniel replied. Good. I'll meet you there. It's time to face this, man. Daniel hung up, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. At the hospital, Tom was waiting at the entrance. His face was serious. Dan, Margaret's upstairs. She saw the news. It's time for you to talk to her. Daniel's heart raced. I don't know if I can, Tom. You have to do this, Tom insisted. She deserves to hear the truth from you. Sarah placed a hand on Daniel's arm. He's right. It's time to face your past. Daniel looked at the two of them, grateful for their support. Okay, let's do this. As they headed upstairs to Margaret's room, Daniel received another call. It was Vanessa. You've ruined everything, Daniel, she said. But don't think it's over. I have more to reveal, and trust me, it won't be pretty. Do whatever you want, Vanessa, Daniel responded calmly. I have nothing left to hide. He hung up, feeling lighter. Standing in front of Margaret's room, Daniel froze. Sarah and Tom stopped beside him. You can do this, Sarah encouraged. Daniel took a deep breath and opened the door. Margaret was sitting on the bed, looking out the window. When she turned and saw Daniel, her eyes widened. Daniel? Her voice was barely a whisper. Hi, Mom, Daniel replied, his voice trembling. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Then, Margaret opened her arms, and Daniel rushed to embrace her, years of suppressed emotions finally pouring out. I'm sorry, he sobbed. I'm sorry for everything. Margaret stroked his hair as she used to when he was a child. Shh, it's okay. You're here now. In the minutes that followed, Daniel told his mother everything, his journey, his struggles, his regrets. Margaret listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying. I always knew you'd do great things, she said at last. I just wish I could have been part of it. You were, Daniel replied. Everything I am, I owe to you. Sarah watched the scene, tears in her own eyes. She realized she was witnessing not just a powerful story, but a deeply human moment of redemption. As mother and son talked, Tom pulled Sarah aside. He's going to need help to face what's coming, Tom said. I think you could be that help, Sarah nodded, surprised by her own conflicting feelings. I'll do what I can. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. Daniel stayed by his mother's side, making plans for the future, promising to be there. When they finally left the room, it was already night. In the hallway, Daniel turned to Sarah. Thank you for being here, he said softly. It's my job, she replied. But they both knew it was more than that. At that moment, Sarah's phone rang. It was her editor. Mitchell, we need this story. Is Reeves canceling the merger or not? Sarah looked at Daniel, a silent question in her eyes. Daniel nodded slowly. Tell him I'll make an official announcement tomorrow. And Sarah, tell the truth. All of it. Sarah hung up, feeling the weight of responsibility. Are you sure? I'm tired of secrets, Daniel replied. It's time to face the consequences, whatever they may be. As they walked toward the hospital exit, Daniel received another message from Vanessa. More threats, more promises of exposure. She's not going to stop, Daniel muttered. We'll face it, Sarah replied, surprising them both with the use of we. Daniel looked at her, feeling a wave of gratitude and something more, something he didn't dare name just yet. So, he said, a small smile on his lips, ready to write the story of your life? The company auditorium was packed. Executives, shareholders, and journalists waited anxiously for the announcement of the merger that promised to create one of the country's largest conglomerates. Daniel Reeves was backstage, adjusting his tie and reviewing his notes. Sarah approached him. Ready? Daniel took a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. At that moment, Tom appeared, out of breath. Dan, you won't believe it. Your mother's here. What? Daniel exclaimed, surprised. How? I brought her, Tom explained. She saw the news and insisted on coming. She said she wanted to be here for you. Daniel felt a wave of emotion. Where is she? Front row, Tom replied. No one knows who she is yet. The announcer called Daniel's name and the audience applauded. It was time. Daniel walked onto the stage, the spotlights momentarily blinding him. He saw familiar faces, board members, business partners. Vanessa was there, her gaze cold and calculating. And then, in the front row, he saw Margaret. She smiled at him, and Daniel felt a surge of courage. Good afternoon, everyone, he began. We're here to discuss the future of our company. But before we talk about mergers and acquisitions, I need to speak about something more important. The truth. A murmur spread through the crowd. Many of you have seen the recent news about my past. Today I want to confirm, yes, I grew up in a trailer park. Yes, my mother worked as a housekeeper to raise me. And yes, I abandoned her in my pursuit of success. Daniel paused, looking directly at Margaret. My mother is here today. Margaret Bennett, please stand. Margaret stood slowly under the astonished gazes of the audience. This woman sacrificed everything for me, Daniel continued, his voice choked with emotion. And I repaid her with years of silence and neglect. Today, I'm here to make that right. He turned to the executives. The merger we came here to discuss today would represent billions in profits, but at what cost? How many Margaret Bennetts would be left behind in our quest for more money? Vanessa stood up abruptly. Daniel, think carefully about what you're doing. He ignored her and continued. I've decided that I cannot, in good conscience, move forward with this merger. Instead, I'm proposing something different. The room erupted in whispers. Daniel raised his hand, asking for silence. I propose a new comprehensive healthcare program for all our employees, including those in lower-paying positions. Additionally, we will create a foundation to support families in situations like the one I grew up in. The shareholders began shouting, some in support, others in protest. Daniel saw Sarah in the crowd, smiling and furiously taking notes. I know many of you are concerned about profits, Daniel continued. But I believe that by investing in our workforce, in our communities, we will create a different kind of wealth, one that can't be measured in dollars and cents alone. He paused, looking at his mother again. Margaret had tears in her eyes but was smiling with pride. I've spent years building an empire of glass based on lies and shame about my past. Today, I choose to build something more solid, based on honesty and compassion. The room was silent now, everyone absorbing the impact of his words. For those who want to join me on this new journey, the doors are open. For those who don't, I understand and respect your decision. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling a tremendous weight lift off his shoulders. Thank you all for listening. And Mom, He looked directly at Margaret. "Thank you for never giving up on me." With that, he left the stage. The auditorium erupted in a mix of applause, shouts, and heated discussions. Backstage, Sarah was the first to reach him. "Daniel, that was incredible." Before he could respond, Margaret hugged him, crying, "My son, I'm so proud of you." Tom joined them, smiling. "You did the right thing, man." The moment was interrupted by Vanessa, who appeared furious. "You just threw away billions, Daniel. I hope you're happy." Daniel looked at her calmly. "I am, Vanessa. For the first time in years, I really am." She stormed off, leaving the group behind. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Daniel looked at his mother, then at Sarah and Tom. "Now, we start rebuilding. For real this time." As the chaos continued outside, Daniel felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but for the first time, he felt he was heading in the right direction. "Let's go home," he said to Margaret. "We have a lot to talk about." Sarah laughed, feeling lighter despite the gravity of the situation. "I can't wait." Together, they stepped into the night, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. Daniel's empire might be crumbling, but something new and perhaps more valuable was rising from the ashes. The days following Daniel's presentation were a whirlwind. The company's stocks plummeted, furious investors demanded explanations, and the media didn't relent. Daniel was in his office, reviewing financial reports, when his assistant walked in. "Mr. Reeves, the Thompson family is here. They're demanding an immediate meeting." Daniel sighed. Vanessa's family, the company's main shareholders. "Send them in." Vanessa's father, Robert Thompson, stormed in like a hurricane. "Reeves, have you lost your mind? Billions thrown away because of a guilty conscience?" "Mr. Thompson, I understand your frustration, but—" "Frustration?" Robert interrupted. "This is beyond frustration. We're pulling all our investment, and we'll make sure others follow suit." Daniel remained calm. "You have that right, but I believe in the new direction of the company." Robert laughed without humor. "Good luck keeping this company afloat without our support." After the Thompson family's stormy exit, Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhausted. The phone rang. It was Sarah. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "One day at a time," Daniel replied. "And you? How's the article coming along?" "Almost done. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about it. I'm thinking of taking a different approach." "What do you mean?" "Instead of just focusing on your story, I want to write about redemption and corporate responsibility. Use you as a case study for a broader change in the business world." Daniel felt a wave of gratitude. "That would be incredible, Sarah. Thank you. Don't thank me just yet. Oh, and Margaret called. She wants to see you." Daniel's heart raced. "All right. Thanks for letting me know." Hours later, Daniel parked in front of the modest house where Margaret now lived. He hesitated for a moment before knocking. Margaret opened the door, her face lighting up. "Daniel, come in, come in." The house was small but cozy. Photos of Daniel as a child lined the walls. "You kept all these?" Daniel asked, moved. Margaret smiled. "Of course. You've always been my greatest pride." They sat in the living room. For a moment, they were silent, the years of distance weighing between them. "Mom, I'm sorry for everything." Margaret took Daniel's hand. "I know, dear. But you're here now. That's what matters." "How did you manage?" Daniel asked. "All these years, alone." "It wasn't easy," Margaret admitted. "There were days I thought about giving up, but I always held on to hope that one day you'd come back." Daniel felt tears welling up. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "It's not about deserving, Daniel. It's about love. And I never stopped loving you." They talked for hours. Daniel shared about the years of struggle, the tough decisions, the weight of success. Margaret talked about her life, the jobs she had, the hardships she faced. "You know," Margaret said, "when I saw you on that stage, speaking the truth, it was the proudest moment of my life." Daniel hugged his mother, feeling for the first time in years truly at home. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. "Honestly, I don't know. The company is in crisis. I might lose everything." Margaret squeezed Daniel's hand. "You have me now. We'll face this together." Back at the office, Daniel found his team in panic. More investors had pulled their support following the Thompsons. "Mr. Reeves," his CFO said, "if this continues, we'll be bankrupt in weeks." Daniel looked at his tired team. "I know I've asked a lot from you. If anyone wants to leave, I understand. But for those who stay, I promise, we'll rebuild this the right way." To his surprise, no one left. His assistant stepped forward. "We're with you, Mr. Reeves." That night, Daniel worked late, searching for solutions. Sarah appeared with coffee. "I thought you could use this," she said, handing him a cup. "You're an angel," Daniel smiled, grateful. Sarah sat down. "How did it go with your mom?" Daniel shared about the meeting, his voice full of emotion. Sarah listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "Daniel," she finally said, "I think I've found the perfect angle for my article. Your story, the company's transformation. It's about second chances, about redemption." Daniel nodded, feeling a new wave of determination. "That's exactly it, Sarah. We're starting over, and this time, we're doing it right." As they worked late into the night, Daniel felt, despite the challenges, a peace he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be tough, but for the first time, he was facing it with honesty and purpose. 6 months had passed since Daniel's life had turned upside down. The sun was rising over the city as he walked into the hospital, greeting nurses and doctors along the way. Not as a VIP visitor, but as someone who had become part of the daily routine. Daniel arrived at Margaret's room and found her sitting up reading a book. "Good morning, Mom," he smiled, kissing her on the forehead. "Daniel, dear, you don't have to come every day, you know. I want to be here," he replied, sitting beside her. "How are you feeling today?" "Dr. Phillips said I might be discharged in 2 weeks," Margaret said, excited. "That's great, Mom. We'll celebrate when you get out of here." While helping Margaret with her breakfast, Daniel received a message from Sarah. "Meeting at 10 a.m. to discuss the new foundation. Don't be late." Daniel smiled. Over the past few months, his relationship with Sarah had grown from a professional partnership to something deeper. After saying goodbye to Margaret, Daniel headed to the hospital's meeting room. Sarah was already there, along with Tom and some executives from Daniel's old company. "Good morning, everyone," Daniel began. "Let's talk about the next steps for the Second Chance Foundation." "The preliminary results are promising," Sarah presented. "Productivity has gone up. Absenteeism has decreased." Tom added, "And more companies are showing interest in adopting the model." Daniel listened, feeling a mix of pride and humility. The road hadn't been easy. He had lost most of his fortune, his position as CEO, and the respect of many in the corporate world. But he had gained something far more valuable. After the meeting, Daniel and Sarah walked through the hospital garden. "You look tired," Sarah observed, taking his hand. Daniel smiled. "I am, but it's a good kind of tired, you know? I have a surprise for you," Sarah said, handing him an envelope. Daniel opened it, his eyes widening. "A nomination for the Social Innovation Award? The foundation is making a difference, Daniel. People are noticing." They embraced, the moment filled with emotion and promise. That evening, Daniel, Sarah, Margaret, who had been given permission for a brief outing, Tom, and a few close friends gathered for a simple dinner at Daniel's new home, much smaller than his old mansion but infinitely more welcoming. During dinner, Daniel looked at the faces around him. His mother, smiling and chatting happily with Sarah. Tom, his loyal friend, playing with the children of one of the foundation's staff. Daniel stood up, raising his glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "to second chances, to new directions, and to family, both the one we're given and the one we choose." Later, when the guests had left, Daniel and Sarah stayed on the porch, looking at the stars. "Did you ever imagine we'd be here 6 months ago?" Sarah asked, leaning against him. Daniel chuckled softly. "Not in my wildest dreams. Any regrets?" He thought for a moment. "Only that I didn't do this sooner, that it took me so long to realize what really matters." Sarah kissed him softly. "What's important is that you did." His true legacy, he realized, wouldn't be measured in dollars or stocks, but in the lives he touched, the changes he inspired. And that, more than any fortune, was something worth living for.